Hi, session 5. Let's talk about experiential therapy. So, a couple quotes. One, nothing matters in therapy unless it's accompanied by a change in behavior. Lots of therapy centers, it's going to be a needle point on a wall somewhere. And apologies are not meaningful. A change in behavior is meaningful. A little bit of folky folk wisdom. Um, Therapy might aim at different goals. Each style or school of therapy has in mind an answer to one question: what is the good life? That's a philosophic question, and one that's been debated for literally thousands of years. Student papers always start with that line. For as long as people have had questions, that kind of. But this time it really applies. For literally thousands of years, philosophy has asked the question: what constitutes the good life? Ultimately, that answer may prove mostly subjective or even possibly unknowable. Ask someone if their life is good, then ask them why or why not. And people will generally struggle to voice their reasons. There's something ineffable here. Ineffability is concerned with ideas that cannot or perhaps should not be expressed in spoken words. Broadly speaking, broadly speaking, behaviorism is after functional behavior. The good life is a life in which people's behaviors achieve their ends and achieve those ends efficiently. Psychoanalysis is after insight. Why am I like this? What happened to me to make me like this? And that is, that's all the goal. CBT would seek symptom reduction through logical thought, through eliminating errors in thinking. You get rid of the thinking errors, you get rid of the dysfunctional feelings, emotions that are associated with those errors in thinking. Humanism is more or less all about agency for the client, and existentialism, you could say, is looking for meaning in difficult experiences. For an insight therapy, the overarching goal, the way you know you've done a good job today is the client has an aha moment. Aha! I understand. I get it now. I see it now. Some therapy is archaeological. People are seen as so complicated that some of their self is unknown to their self. They do things without knowing why, have emotions without a known cause. I'm anxious for no reason. Oh, honey, you are not. You might not know the reason, but if you're anxious, it is for a reason. Therapy in various forms means hiring a guide to show you through yourself as though at an open house at a college or a hospital. The analyst in the past preferred to be out of view of the patient, sometimes called the analysand. Being able to see the doctor and their reactions would distract the patient from this work of their self excavation, their free associations. Anything about the current moment would be redirected back to that excavation. In this model, the analysand has no real relationship with the analyst. Anything about the current moment is seen as transference, a repeat of a past relationship. By denying immediacy, the analyst is protected and the client sent back to their archaeology. In more modern psychodynamic therapies, insight is both sought after and confounded. The dynamic in psychodynamic means change. The therapist changes every experience into another experience. The relationship isn't real, it's transference. The thought is an emotion. The emotion is a behavior. The behavior is in Irv Yalom's 1980 book about existential psychotherapy. He went through all of Freud's case notes, and one of the shocking things that he found was that whenever a patient mentioned death, Freud changed the conversation into one about sex. The client didn't bring up sex, the client brought up death. Freud changed the road. It might be helpful to integrate thoughts, feelings, and actions in this way. See the previous lecture on authenticity, but it might also tend to confuse clients. Every time they make headway on a thought, they get redirected into a feeling or an action. I mean, we've all met people and even clients who are so much in their thoughts. They're having these emotions they can't see, and we might want to try and integrate all that. These kinds of therapies tend to be relatively directive. Imagine this. Take a breath. What happens if you breathe through that pain? Tell me more about this. And the end goal is often or usually that aha moment. Aha, I see it now. Aha, I remember this event I had forgotten. Aha, I know why I'm so angry with my mother. Freud imagined people were more or less set in stone by about the age of 5. To find out about people, you had to uncover their antique formative experiences, yeah, usually with mommy. Then people could sometimes see themselves in his theories or myths, stories, roadmaps. Aha, it's all about this thing. But then what? Freud didn't imagine that people would change much, or at all, really. They would just have more information with which to make their decisions. Would they suffer less? Would they hurt other people less? Well, that's just not what analysis was for. And man, this might sound like criticism, and it doesn't have to be. Who said all therapy had to be about one thing, about making symptoms go away, about personal change? Is that what it's for? Who decided that? Not psychoanalysis, not Freud. Okay, right alongside the idea of the insight, the moment of insight, is the idea of explicit meaning. And let's talk about Viktor Frankl. In interviews, Frankl said the meaning of life is not something the therapist could or should provide. Doctors can't and shouldn't give it to you. Religious leaders can't. Politicians can't. And doing so violates some kind of trust, some arrangement with the universe, if not necessarily strictly with ethics codes. Your suffering is yours to bear. And if a simple story takes that suffering away, that might be a disservice. It's also likely to be a false cure. The suffering has been driven out of immediate awareness, but might continue. Frankl himself could not live up to the standard that he called for. In Man's Search for Meaning, in the end notes about logotherapy, he describes an elderly man whose wife has died. The man's grief is immense, overpowering. And through tears, he asks Frankl, why? Why did she have to die first? Why did I have to go on living without her? I should have died first rather than bearing this grief. And Frankl replies with a quite definite answer. He says, in outliving your wife, you spared her this feeling. The man left the room happy, by Frankl's account, with a meaning in words he could apply to his experience. But there's no follow-up. What became of this unnamed patient? What became of this unnamed patient? Did he no longer cry sipping his tea at night? Did he return to his usual social rounds absent his wife? Or did this message slip a should into his suffering? You should go on living with this grief because it spares another the same grief. Now the suffering is a duty and isn't necessarily inherently meaningful. My back hurts. I've alluded to this before. I've worked in developmental disabilities for about 20 years, doing for people the things they couldn't do for themselves. In the beginning, I was young and large and strong. Now I'm only large. So I tended to be assigned houses with either the most disabled or the most violent people. One of my favorites was Steve. Steve knew a couple of words. I only ever heard him say hi and mom. He was always cheerful, happy to see people, completely unaware of his limitations, and he had no balance at all. Right? The mechanisms in your inner ear that would provide that didn't have it. He was strong enough to walk, but 100% of the time, his head would get too far ahead and he'd fall over. And so he needed supervision and he needed physical support to walk. While I was working with him, his health started to fail. He got pneumonia, and it took a while to diagnose the pneumonia, too long to diagnose the pneumonia. And then he was more susceptible. He had lung scarring and would have these repeated lung infections. He had pneumonia several times in 1 year. The medical doctors didn't want to prescribe him antibiotics until they'd seen him. And they always needed 2 weeks to see him. In the meantime, my job was to keep the man from drowning in his own fluids. That meant getting up and walking even when he was too weak. Steve weighed about 75 kilograms, 160 or so pounds. And the job was to get behind him, about 1.5 feet behind him, hold on to his gait belt. Body's not touching, let him do most of the work. And over time, over weeks, this really messed up my back pretty bad. I saved Steve's life. At least for a little while. I knew while I was doing it that I would end up feeling this pain forever, and I did it anyway, because there wasn't anybody else. And Steve's life had value to me, more value than my ongoing comfort. The pain still hurts. I can tell this story about it. I can give you explicit meaning in words, but that's not what the pain means. There's a deeper and more implicit meaning. It's not that the explicit meaning makes it bearable. It's that I've spent a lot of time reflecting on pain. And I've become big enough inside that I can feel pain, I can have pain, and not be had by the pain. I don't tolerate pain. I accept it. I feel it. I let it be. If 20 years ago Viktor Frankl had showed up and told me what the pain meant in words, that would have been of no value. I had to discover this all alone. Let's move on to Irv Yalom. Irv is an interpersonal psychotherapist. He's an interpersonalist. Yalom trained under Rollo May, and he used that training, that therapeutic lineage, essentially to get famous, very successful. He published books, he traded on this reputation, and so somewhat co-opted existentialism to his name. His books are good. It is absolutely worth the time to read his books, think about them. He's a fine introduction to the field, but He isn't the field. In the business, we refer to Irvin Yalom as the gateway drug into existentialism. It's also important to note that Yalom denies existentialism as a standalone practice, calling it instead a throw in. Here's your soup recipe, here's the basic ingredients. And as you taste the soup, wondering what else it needs to be personally satisfying to you, you grab whatever, herbs and spices you have on hand, and a pinch of this and a touch of that. Existentialism to Yalom is just some seasoning you'd add to a soup that's already good. You might get that impression in your existential certifications. We tend to recruit students who are already practicing psychotherapists, who are looking for that thing to like expand and deepen their practice. There just are too few of us to teach existentialism as a standalone practice in graduate school. There aren't people who know how to do it. Yalom's real school of thought is, again, interpersonalism. The idea is that every problem is a relational problem. Anything troubling a person troubles them because it originates in human interaction or impacts ongoing human interaction. The best level of intervention, then, for Irv is human interaction. This means having a relationship. In individual therapy, the therapist has the relationship with the client. We say often it is the relationship that heals, and existentialists especially, that it gets us right there. There's good empirical data to suggest that this is a great starting point, a wonderful starting point. In group therapy, the therapist facilitates productive relationships among several clients. Yalom notes in the theory and practice of group psychotherapy that patients go through a predictable process. In the beginning, they listen to each other's stories, they offer advice. A client struggles in love because she always ends up with the same kind of man, and that kind of man takes advantage of her, and the other clients tell her why she picks them. Aha, you're dating your father. Or, you secretly don't think you're good enough. And then they tell her what she should do. You should try this dating app. The thing has much more compatibility stuff. Or you have to love yourself first. That's great, easy advice to follow. Or look for these warning signs or something. And none of this helps anyone. Clients either ignore the advice or they take it and things get worse, or they take it and things get better, and that is the most rare and the worst of the possible outcomes. And, mostly the group gets frustrated with each other. They point out there's no point telling us these stories if you're going to ignore us. And the client with the problem starts to realize they don't want advice. They don't even want things to get better. That's not what they came for. This stage is called storming. That's apt. It's a stormy time. Givers of advice question their role in the room. It can't be to be the wise person, to be the helper. And recipients of advice question, what do they really want from the group? Advice makes them feel smaller, lesser. These people are also there for a reason. They're not succeeding at living, not more so than any of the other clients or patients in the room. They're failing in some way also at life. What makes them qualified to weigh in on my life? When the group starts to wonder this stuff, they transition into the performing stage. In this stage, rather than offering advice, they ask each other, what do you need from me? What do you need from this group? What can we do? And they wonder themselves, what do I need? What would be helpful? And it turns out that helping isn't helping. It takes time and honesty and, yeah, a certain degree of teamwork to find all that out. What people need in the end is to be witnessed and to receive empathy. They need the holding space where they can share their selves, try on ways of being, and sort through their experiences. In studies of children who go through difficult experiences but come out well, a common factor in their resilience is some mentor figure, usually not part of the immediate family. This person does not give advice. They listen while the child sorts through their experiences and reaches their own conclusions. The mentor cannot help, they're not involved. In a more extreme case, Kirk Schneider, is it the rediscovery of all? Discusses the case of a homeless child whose confidants were a pair of homeless men, in no position to protect or nurture or feed or instruct. It was just their steady presence, their listening ears. That was all the boy in question needed, and he came out fine. Now, do you remember a question? Do you remember a question I asked in the first training session? Do you ever feel powerless? As the therapist, do you ever feel powerless in therapy? Existential therapy is experiential. Insight happens sometimes, overtly, and that's fine. Even better if the person feels helped. But it isn't the goal. We aren't here to facilitate explicit insight, or worse, especially to make explicit insight happen. The relationship has to be good for anything else to work. It isn't everything. Classical humanism, the Rogerian client centered approach, is demonstrated to take clients a certain way and then fizzle out. The client needs something more than accurate empathy, positive regard, and sincerity. They need some engagement, interpretation, some theory of the case. The relationship enables the work. It's more than rapport. It's a working relationship. It's two-sided, mutually engaged presence that we cultivate. But the work is done intentionally by attending to the here and now experiences and attending to the existential concerns rather than running for them or redirecting them. We have experiences with the client that change that client. We're talking about a deeper insight, some insight from the self. My doctor cried for me because I could not cry for myself. Something was blocked. I'd been conditioned out of it. Grow up, boys don't cry, be a man, walk it off, rub some dirt on it. His tears directly bypassed decades of abuse. It was a real expression of empathy, beyond words, a vital connection that let my tears flow. I cried there in front of him, unafraid and unashamed. I had that experience of unpunished tears, facilitated through a trusting relationship. Now I can cry. I do. I do a lot. I cry in front of patients. I cry in front of students. I cry in front of my son, strangers in public. It's a human experience that I had been missing. And my therapist helped me be more human. I didn't have a flash of realization that I'd been conditioned not to cry. I knew that. My body knew it. My mind knew it. I knew it at my father's funeral when the tears would start and then stop, withheld by something inside. I knew it when I was telling Dr. Whitty the story. The insight was not helpful. What I needed was mutual empathy. He cried for me. He felt the grief that I felt and cried. And then I felt the grief he felt because I felt it. And I cried for him, crying for me. Then I was finally able to do it for myself. This emerged. It emerged from me through the process, not in a flash, not in a moment, and not as part of a program or a technique. Deeper still, no one with a meaningful life ever pondered the meaning of life. Dr. Freud, what is the meaning of life? Love and work. Meaning is usually inherent in existence through primary process. We work, we interact, we respond to our emotional cues about our experiences. We engage naturally, thoughtlessly, unplanned with people, things, pets, tasks. Flow is when we're so engaged we lose track of time. You show up for your shift at the hospital, maybe somewhat dreading it, and then suddenly it's time to go home. You've been engaged, doing things just challenging enough to demand your attention. And that's life. That's life. Sometimes we get tossed out of the flow of life. Work is menial and there's nobody to engage us while we do it. And then we might need to search for some deeper meaning in the menial work. I'm stuffing these envelopes and whatever, so a charity can raise money so they can feed the children. That outside meaning might provide enough motivation to keep doing the menial task, but it probably doesn't reinsert us into the experience of flow. In good therapy, in deep therapy, we engage with the person in a real way, in a presenceful way, favoring the here and now. What's going on in the room? How is it to remember those feelings now? I notice I asked you for a feeling and you gave me a thought. How do you feel though now? When you say that, I feel something. This is about philosophy. Yeah, sure. I can't change people who aren't here. I can't take away your past traumas, and if I could, man, I wouldn't. And this is about inherent meaning, the meaning of love and work, of engagement with this moment now. This is a meaning that is ineffable. It can't be said in words, and it might be hubris or sacrilege to try. The Tao that can be said in words is not the constant Tao. Learning to engage with the here and now in therapy can transfer into the bigger world. to be with yourself and then to be with others the way your therapist is with you. Reinsert back into the flow. When we're together in the therapy room, we get that flow together. Can you take it with you? It might be risky to try. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it might be risky. There are risks, and I've been doing this long enough to have a reasonable handle on what those are. So I try to list them at the start of every therapy. This here is from my supervision contract. Your supervision contract, your initial disclosure form, it should include the risks, benefits, and alternatives to the process. Right? So risks. Existential psychotherapy does not attempt to make people feel better. Prolonged work with the approach might result in difficult emotions worsening. In fact, that's kind of typical. Existentialists face life as it is. Trainees might experience dread or despair as they encounter facts they would as soon avoid. Existentialists bear up under the suffering of their clients, which can be quite painful. Finally, this is a relational approach, which sometimes produces dissatisfaction with one's non-therapeutic or non-supervisory relationships. On the rewards side, potentially people who engage in the practices of existential supervision and therapy change their lives. Trainees might become more authentic. They might become sadder and wiser. Their relationships might deepen. They might gain more capacity to cope with troubling emotions. Existential psychotherapy also alters perspectives such that cases that seemed previously futile, seen in a new light, offer us hope. This might result in the ability to persevere with difficult cases. Here's some stuff to think about. What does unconditional positive regard look like in practice? Let's think about it. Can you have positive regard for people who have done terrible things? And can you manage positive, unconditional, positive regard for yourself? Okay, bye.